Hello, I am Manuel Adrogué from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I do classical taekwondo. Welcome to part 2 of episode 9, which is the last of this highly ambitious Korean kicking project. Today I am dressed up because this is the grand finale in which I will be sharing special information, and I want to celebrate the ending of this series. It took me 2 years to prepare it, and here I will examine the relationship among modern Korean martial arts. On episodes number 2, 3, and 5, a detailed description of Taekwondo's history was provided. This video completes the tour with a review of the history of Korean martial arts in an attempt to answer the question, what is traditional when referring to Korean martial arts? By the end of the 20th century, the different Korean martial art governing bodies had successfully built some walls separating their respective martial arts with simplistic narratives about their origin. Martial artists have been conditioned not to question their elders' teachings as part of the values of loyalty and tradition. The strange thing is that none of these traditions or styles existed as such 100 years ago, so traditionalism is a tricky word here. In martial arts circles, a rather particular idea of loyalty has predominated over critical thinking. I am convinced that the only way for martial arts to progress is that in all matters, technical, ethical, or any nature, they are treated by their own proponents with strict intellectual honesty and standards. In the field of Korean martial arts study, there are people who have embraced those high standards by challenging common knowledge, by asking and exploring, opening ways for others. When I say this, I am thinking about people such as George Vitale and Sanko Lewis, as well as Udo Mönig and Stephen Kappener. I must add the positive contributions of independent, inquisitive publishers such as Stuart Anslow, or the talented writer and journalist Alex Gillis, whose book, A Killing Art, caught the attention of people around the world on the true history of Korean Taekwondo. Let me clarify, I do not share some of their opinions on certain topics, but I value their courage of taking Taekwondo as a serious matter of study in the context of social sciences. If Taekwondo is to be considered a credible discipline worth of being studied, then it must conform to the academic standards found in universities and scientific groups. I insist that independent research is crucial to ensure that diverse approaches and looks are considered in all areas for the development of Taekwondo. Anyway, I don't want to digress. In this video, you will see information different than what's usual in connection with Korean martial arts history. I have done my best to put together the puzzle for you to have a proper perspective of the forest and not just your tree. Believe me, it will be interesting, and by doing so, you might actually get something new to know about your own tree. I recommend that you grab a pen and a notebook so that you may write down some names or things that may interest you, so that later you may want to make your own research and look for additional videos on the subject. First, I want to challenge the idea of how traditional martial arts look. The image of dozens of students wearing the same white uniform while adopting strong stances and doing sharp movement under the command of an instructor has become the most common representation of what is a traditional martial art. That image may really correspond to pre-World War II Japanese universities, the Korean Army, all the movies, but the image has become quite entrenched. As it refers to Taekwondo, the army was indeed an ever-present factor due to the Korean War, and the 1961 coup d'etat put the country under military government until full democratic elections occurred in 1987. And the sending of Korean troops to Vietnam occurred in that era, so the Korean Army had a substantial role in the development of Taekwondo. This means that Taekwondo is technically martial, which means military, in a very true and proper manner. Providing martial arts training to massive groups has a long history in Asia, China, Korea, Japan. Okinawan Todi was practiced one-on-one with the teacher or in small groups, as well as solo, with very few formal standards. No uniforms, no yelling, no group dynamics reinforcing a collective perception of toughness. In some way, person-to-person instruction replicated the way that Kung Fu had been practiced and passed down in Chinese villages, particularly in the south, as opposed to the earlier northern Chinese military tradition in which troops trained in weapons in large groups, as seen, for example, in the Mulan movies. 20th century Japanese and Korean karate have taken ownership of the image of traditional martial art in the eyes of the Western world. The massive, strict ambiance, coupled with simple and direct moral directives, is very suitable to build the bodies and instill courage in young troops. But that regime does not work for older age groups or other life circumstances. The military approach has an expiration date because the class format cannot accommodate those who intend to explore the martial way in a deeper manner. So, I question the military style as being the traditional martial art way. Korean martial culture, in this respect, is closer to the Okinawan. Although Koreans had a strong warrior imprint during the first millennium of our era, during the Yi or Joseon period starting on 1392 AD, Buddhism and military matters were to some extent put aside by the ruling class. In that sense, similarly to Okinawa and opposed to Japan, at that point Korea was not a warrior culture but a civil one. Okinawa was marked by commerce, as it was the port in the routes of merchants at that part of the world. Korea was absorbed in itself, trying to improve its bureaucracy under Neo-Confucianism with a focus on culture and science. In the area of martial art history, we usually hear rather unsophisticated explanations based on true but partial premises that lead to erroneous conclusions and prevent to achieve an intelligent and realistic perspective on that matter. Let me provide 3 examples. One is the ancient history narrative, which is based on, first, that remains of organized martial training have been found in Korea dating at least 20 centuries. Second premise is that at different points, martial art training in Korea changed its name, but not its essence, and so the proposed conclusion is 3, that Taekwondo is simply a new name for the old Korean martial arts. That reasoning is wrong because it fails to trace some reliable, proven link between Taekwondo and those old arts. However, there is some truth to it. The second premise is that the founders of those Kwan had previously learned Japanese karate almost exclusively, and so the proposed conclusion is that modern Taekwondo is just a variation of Japanese karate. That reasoning is also wrong because it fails to acknowledge the substantial transformation that Taekwondo underwent in Korea due to new circumstances, as well as the critical influence of other non-karate sources. And the third example of this type of narrative is the exclusively General Choi narrative, which states that, first, General Choi proposed the Taekwondo name and a new set of forms or patterns. Second, that Taekwondo did not exist before, so he is the founder and creator, and then, therefore, the proposed conclusion is that Taekwondo is a new martial art entirely created in 1955 by General Choi, and thus anyone using such name but not following General Choi's forms or ideas is doing fake Taekwondo. While it is true that General Choi coined the name Taekwondo and that he had a decisive influence in Taekwondo's origin, spreading, and technical advancement, this conclusion ignores, for example, that Taekwondo is well regarded for its kicks, and that those kicks were developed independently from his ideas. There are simply too many things, even in ITF Taekwondo, that exceed General Choi's intervention. It is interesting that the three narratives have strong elements of truth, even in their conclusions, but they are partial. There's a saying that goes, half a truth is often a whole lie. So, I will briefly review all sources and influences of martial arts knowledge that arrived to Korea and that are relevant for modern martial arts. The knowledge coming from those foreign sources adopted a local flavor and turned into a Korean version. In turn, many of those Korean varieties got into contact and influenced each other, some significantly, others marginally. A very detailed chronological account of Korea's ancient military history can be found in Barry Harmon's book. However, I will only address history to explain the lines that directly or indirectly converge into modern-day Korean martial arts. We will be building a chart summarizing the information in 6 steps, which will not be chronological but conceptual, following the way packages of knowledge flowed from the past. Please note that these are not 6 identifiable trends, but simply my way to organize and expose the information. First, I will mention the old 5th century subak in Korea, which is not clear on whether it was developed locally or brought from China. Then we will see how the Chinese army training methods of the 15th century became the basis of the Korean Muye Dobotongji military manual using the name subak, and how that has come to us through modern Shipalki. Second is the often ignored presence of Kung Fu in Korea that arrived during the 20th century, affecting other martial arts. Third comes Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, which was brought from Japan at the end of World War II through Choi Yong-sul. His first students mixed that with some kicks that they developed using Taekyon as a basis, and HapKiDo started from there, out of which other martial arts emerged. 4. The Buddhist temples became repositories of military knowledge, and throughout history, monks supported and trained popular militias in times of foreign invasions. In villages, the old military subak fighting contests were transformed to serve for a dual purpose of a martial sport during country festivals, as well as a form of permanent training in case men were summoned to protect their homeland. With time, one of those evolutive lines became Taekyon. 5. To Okinawa along many centuries, blending with the local martial arts. Then karate was taken to Japan, where it was significantly transformed during 30 years before being transplanted into Korea. There, it was the basis of the 5 original kwan of Tang Sudo or Kong Sudo. Such karate schools were the platform from where Taekwondo was built. 6. Finally, 3 factors caused the development of the unique Korean kicking method found in Taekwondo and Tang Sudo, which were military training, chest guard sparring, and martial art interbreeding. They occurred at a very special moment of Korean history, with nationalism as a catalyst for the design of new martial arts systems. Let's start by saying that in Korea there has always been a lot of cross-training and eclecticism. For example, my teacher's teacher, Lee Chong-so, was very proficient in HapKiDo, and that permeated in his Taekwondo. As many other Korean instructors, he did not change the name or formal structure of the Taekwondo that he taught. He simply perfected the art of fighting the best way he could. In those days, that was the usual approach to martial arts teaching and training. So let's review the facts. Korea's history has been marked by its struggle to preserve its territorial integrity while being neighbor to China, Asia's superior source of culture, wealth, and military power. Korea had always behaved as a small sister of China, one that would preserve its place with a delicate balance of diplomacy and open wars, at the same time watching Japanese raiders in its coast. Korea had an isolationist policy. Besides survival, during the Joseon period, pride over its advanced national culture was among Korea's highest concerns. Some of the milestones of Korea's military history are its recovery of Manchurian territory in the 4th century of this era, repelling China's invasion during the 7th century, the Mongols' 13th century invasion, and the successful Imjin Wars made up by Hideyoshi's 2 invasion attempts launched from Japan in the 1590s. According to archaeological remains, both in China and Korea, there existed a military hand-to-hand combat discipline which had the same generic term. It was called striking hand, respectively called shoubuo, excuse my rough pronunciation, in Chinese, and subak in Korean. Historical records showed that during the 5th century, if not before, Korean Koguryo Kingdom warriors trained in archery, wrestling, and subak. It is not possible to establish if such fighting skills had an independent origin and converged, or if they were imported from one country to the other. By the early 15th century, subak was established in the Korean Joseon Kingdom military, both for training and fighting contests, and it was part of the army admission test. In 1561, Chinese Ming General Qi Shi Huang, again, excuse my pronunciation, wrote the Book of Effective Discipline, called Ji Xiao Shinshu, in Korean, Kiyo Shinso, a manual where General Qi analyzes military preparation after his successful career as a commander defending the Shandong coasts against pirates and the northern frontier against Mongols. Qi Shi Huang's military manual included an empty-hand set of 32 postures based on Shaolin Taisu Changchuan, the Grand Ancestor or Grand Emperor Long Fist, which is a primordial Kung Fu method developed during the 13th century. That Kung Fu style is believed to be one of the methods that later served as the basis for the creation of Tai Chi Chuan around the early 1600s. General Chi's theatrice was adopted and adapted in new Korean manuals, which continue to record and improve on military technology. Those manuals were called the Muye Jebo of 1598, which included 6 weapon skills, the Muye Shinbo of 1759, which included 18 non-equestrian combat skills, and finally the famous Muye Dobotongji of 1790, covering 24 combat skills. These last 2 Korean books included a section called Kwombok or Subak, and even showed one practice routine which is likely to come from the great emperor's long fist kung fu. It is interesting that the 3 manuals successively increased the techniques from 6 to 18 to 24, and although the most evolved were the 24, the name Muye Shipalki, which means 18 military techniques, is the one that stayed. Around that time in Japan, the samurai also trained 18 military techniques, calling them Bugei Juhappan, which is the Japanese pronunciation for Muye Shipalgi. The martial art relationship between Korea and China has far exceeded the introduction of the military manuals. Korea is very close to northern China, just in front of the Shandong Peninsula across the Yellow Sea. The impact of Chinese martial arts in Korea is not easy to determine in its importance, as it is many times overlooked. The Muye Dobotongji manual is a proof of such difficulty, and although the Korean manual is more detailed and 230 years posterior to its Chinese predecessor, it is hard to put a nationality tag to its content as how apart it was from its prior purely Chinese source. For some time in Korea, the book was thought to be dead, just a string of drawings and cryptic instructions written in an old script. To bring back to life the content of such type of manual is very difficult, not only for the limitation of the graphic means, but also because it was written in Old Chinese, in a different cultural context and with a lot of assumptions. In that sense, Kim Kwang-sok, who was born in 1936, was a bridge to the past. Here note that I'm jumping 150 years into the 20th century. During World War II and during the Korean War, Kim learned a martial art under the name Shipalki from Yoon Myung-dok in a Taoist temple in the Jiri Mountains. Years later, continuing with his martial art practice in Seoul and his concern to preserve the art that he had been taught, he found the Muye Dobotongji. And to his surprise, the book's content showed some of exactly the same techniques that he had been taught and also the routines that he had been learning. With the assistance of university experts using the manual and Kim's own training as a base, the Korean Army's 18th century martial arts have been restored through Kim's publications, and today they are available by means of the Shipalgi Preservation Society and the efforts of Choi Bok-kyu, Park Won-moo, Park Gum-soo, and Marc Verger. So let's take a look at the chart that summarizes what I have said so far. The impact of Chinese Kung Fu over Korean martial arts has been substantial. Now, I am not talking about the Chinese influence of the military training at the 5th century, but about modern times. Just a personal anecdote. On my 2013 travel to Korea, the first morning I went to the park in Seoul for my pre-breakfast training session. I was looking for a wooden post to strike, and as soon as I was having my dialogue with the post, at a close distance I found another martial artist doing a heavier version of the same thing, banging his hand against a column. He wasn't a taekwondo or tang soo do practitioner. He was a praying mantis kung fu guy while in company of his dog. Chinese martial arts experts coming and settling in Korea was a rather usual thing. People move across borders, and this particularly happened during the late 1800s, during the so-called Boxers' Rebellion. Northern kung fu styles such as praying mantis, long fist, tai chi chuan, and bagwajang entered Korea through masters Lim Pu Jang, No So Jon, Yi Duk Kang, Huang Ju Huan, Ko Huang Ju, and Kang Kyong Bang, as explained in James Thero's book on Korean Kung Fu. By the 1960s, these Kung Fu teachers made an impression in the training of martial artists such as Mudo Kwan founder Hwang Ki and Kim Kwan-sok, whom I just mentioned, as well as Kuk-sul leaders. Even a section of a Kung Fu routine was absorbed into Taekwondo's Chong Kwon Pum-se, as shown in episode number 3. The students of these Chinese instructors exchanged information and organized their forms and routines. Thus, a special blend of Northern Kung Fu with a Korean touch was born. To make things confusing, Kung Fu in Korea was generally known as Sipalgi, so the new Korean Kung Fu used that name. As a consequence, today there exist two types of Sipalgi in Korea, one corresponding to the old Korean manuals which became the traditional art of the Joseon dynasty, and the other refers to the Shandong Kung Fu entered into Korea during the 20th century. So let's add that part to our chart, marking it in yellow. Now let's focus on Japan, Korea's other neighbor. The seed of Korean HapKiDo was planted with the arrival of Choi Yong-shul from Japan, where he learned Daito-ryu Aikijutsu from Takeda Sogaku. When he was about 8 years old, Choi was abducted to Japan by a businessman and later abandoned to be sheltered by a Buddhist monk at a temple in Kyoto. The monk was acquainted with Daito-ryu Aikijujitsu head Takeda Sogaku, who took him to his house, where Choi lived and learned for 30 years until he returned to settle in Daegu City in Korea during 1945 after the end of World War II. Once in Korea, Choi taught many students, among them Ji Han-jae, Kim Moo-hong, and So Bok-sub. Ji had received some prior Taekyon instruction, purportedly from descendants of Baekje's Samrang people. I will get to that later. Ji, along with Kim Moo-hong, modified and expanded that base in the area of kicking and integrated it into Choi's teachings. Those kicks were in many ways different to the ones in Taekyon and used spinning in a new way. That was called HapKiDo, after changing its denomination a couple of times and finally became known as HapKiDo. As we saw in episode 2, Ji Han-jae made an enormous impact by pioneering the combination of joint blocking and throwing skills with the Korean weapons and kicking methods. After he structured the most popular HapKiDo syllabus, he organized the Kido-he group. Later, he was hired as an instructor for Korea's Presidential Guard, and then he was introduced to Bruce Lee by Jun Rhee and popularized Korean kicking in the Hong Kong film industry. Along with General Choi and Hwang Ki, he is in the group of the most influential Korean martial artists of all time. In 1963, Ji Han-jae summoned some advanced HapKiDo black belts along with other skilled martial artists outside the Korean karate lineages. They exchanged their knowledge in the areas of joint locks and soft skills originated in Japanese Daito-ryu, weapons and palm strikes. Many of them had learned in temples along with the Korean style of kicking and Chinese forms that were being taught in Korea, as I have just mentioned. Martial arts cross-training and blending was common and is a typical example of Korean eclecticism. This may be seen in a book by Kim Sang-dok and Ko Baek-yong of 1980, which is called Korean HapKiDo. Just look at the collage and the pictures found in that book. It's a martial arts theory manual on how that particular HapKiDo school trained, using elements that we generally associate with Kung Fu, Aikido, or Taekwondo. If you look at this, you will figure how practical and open Koreans may be. The group gathered by Ji Han-jae in 1961 first formed the Daehan Kukmusul Hyobhae and later the Kido-hae. It included talented martial artists such as Ho Il-ung, Lee Han-chul, Lee Ju-bang, So In-hyuk, and Kim Woo-tak. So In-hyuk's grandfather had passed him what he had learned as a member of the Royal Court Guard before its disband in the late 19th century. Differently from Ji's HapKiDo, this so-called Kuksul HapKiDo group practiced forms and included old weapons in their training, maybe transpiring some Kung Fu inspiration. The group later dissembled, and each of those leaders founded their own martial arts schools such as Bulmudo, Kuksul-kwan, HapKiDo, Kuksul-won, and Hwarangdo, which in their best versions are among the most complete and interesting systems in Korean martial arts. As it would be expected, there are some great kickers in those systems. Kuksul HapKiDo made a big impact overseas and in Korea, where in 1978 a derivative art called Tukkong Musul was established to train the special forces. This technical excellence has carried to the next generation that I have been honored to meet, such as Master Scott So in Korea and Lee Tae-jun of Hwarangdo in the United States. There are other links to Chinese martial arts from Korea. The most well-known cases are Yoon Byung-in, Hwang Ki, and Kim Ki-hwang, three of them founding pillars of Korean karate with Kung Fu schooling in Manchuria. So this is the new situation of our chart with the new parts marked in yellow. Now let's see how temples in the Korean countryside connect the old military training of the Koryo dynasty with modern Taekyon. As we've seen, that served as the basis for much of HapKiDo kicking. It is an important fact to know that Korea has a lot of mountains covered in deep forest and very few plains. Its territory is difficult to control by an invading army, and since ancient times, Korean resistance militias were always organized in inaccessible areas, usually near temples, away from coastal cities. The famous righteous armies were irregular militias made up by monks, commoners, and retired army officers that existed in different moments of Korea's history, starting on the Khitan invasion to Koryo during the 10th century. In the Joseon period that started in 1392, Buddhism and the military were not supported, but many temples in remote areas kept some military training alive. In Korea, many times army officers retired from active life going to temples, so temples became natural deposits of martial knowledge. At that point, the Korean military had entered into decline and much of the defense capabilities rested on civilian groups. In the 1590s Imjin Wars, Abbot Sosantesa Hyujong led a force of 5,000 warrior monks against Hideyoshi's invasion. 300 years later, temples also became a refuge when the Japanese disbanded the Korean army in 1907. The Japanese domination had started some decades before, and it is documented that many nationalistic resistance members during the end of the 19th century trained in what in some regions was called Taekyon and in others Subak. The origin of Taekyon has been trained to Subak-hi. One important distinction of Taekyon versus Subak is that old Subak or Shibak contest punches and even headbutts were allowed. Actually, North Koreans are well known for headbutting. As punches were banned, they were replaced by face slaps in a more civilized fights known as pekta, which appropriately means white striking. White striking also became known among civilians as takwon, which means striking fist. Another name for that was subyokta, and it became part of festivals, both in its fighting competition format called subak-hi and its dancing format, which has been preserved in North Korea and Manchuria, and it is known as subak-chum. Jumping, balancing, and innocent folk dances were suitable as a way to disguise and upkeep for long times a demanding training regime, and for commoners to be ready for action to uptake arms if necessary. People in the countryside often practiced these arts close to temples, and thus, as centuries passed, the folk arts and the old military methods combined in this new form of subak, which was different than the original. Coincidentally with pekta, in modern Taekyon, there are fists in its curriculum under the name of Yetbok Taekyon, old days Taekyon, but they are not allowed in competition. It is probable that Subak was a complete fighting art, and Pekta or Taekyon are the competition format, at least by the time of the 18th century. Taekyon is quite different from other East Asian martial arts. Its training is flowing and agile. It is based on rhythmic stepping and bouncing, landing adequate responses against a moving opponent, with a notable resemblance to capoeira's motions in Brazil, including the fact that both arts are trained while playing music. I have heard people dismissing Taekyon as just a game and not a martial art, which reflects some ignorance on how it was used in life-or-death encounters by the Korean resistance. According to Kim Hee-young in his Taekwondo history book, by the late 1800s, two figures were regarded as highly skilled in Taekyon. Im Ho, born in 1875 and deceased in 1945, who produced 9 masters, among them the famous Son Du-ki. Im Ho was renowned for his grabbing strength, and the other is Shin Dok-sok, born in 1878 and deceased in 1908, who was a chief commander of the Writer's Army and was known for his prowess in assaults using kicks against the Japanese soldiers. That Taekyon was trained in the mountains and forests, where it was hard to be spotted by the Japanese occupation. Another important expert was Kim Koo, renowned Korean patriot who in 1896 fought and defeated a sword-wielding agent, Suchida, using evasions and kicks. Kim was arrested for killing such person in the fight, but he was pardoned. In 1919, Koo became head of the Korean government exiled in Taiwan. This shows that connecting Taekyon training with the lower elements of society is not entirely true, but a prejudice that served pro-Japanese faction to keep Koreans weak and unable to resist the occupation. Korean resistance martial artists in the 19th century trained under the idea to ambush and terminate their enemies using any resources available. These fighters did not train for open battle, and they did not train to be palace guards. They were expected to be precise and deadly attackers, loners or in small groups, in line with the symbolic long-time identification of the Korean people with their national animal, the tiger, an identification that exists to this very day. It is a historical irony that a nation that never had an expansive character had to resort to a predator's attitude for its protection. And that harsh approach of using a finishing attack by surprise became embedded in the Korean view of combat. As bow and arrow and swords and spears had been the choice of Koreans during the Koryo and early Joseon periods, in modern times during the Japanese occupation, the Korea Writers' Army resorted to swords, axes, knives and kicks, in addition to the few available firearms that could be smuggled. Now, an additional comment about Taekyon and Subak in the last 100 years. Two lines of martial practice called Subak survived until the 20th century. One, led by Song Chang-ryul, and now preserved in the Korea Subak Federation, and the other was passed from Il-dong to Shin Han-song, who integrated it into Taekyon. I already went through this in episode 3 for further detail. Taekyon was brought back to life in the 1970s by Song Du-ki and his student Shin Han-song. Shin helped to organize Taekyon's syllabus, and he considered that Subak and Taekyon were the same. By the way, to prevent any confusion, I must clarify that there is no relationship between this Subak I am talking about and the modern Subak-do Mudokwan. Song and Shin taught many students, and at present there are 5 branches related to these arts, with many former Taekwondo black belts who have joined them with the interest of exploring the traditional Korean arts. I have been very lucky to participate in classes under Master Do Ki-hyung, a very talented teacher who has organized a competition circuit seen in Korean television called Taekyon Battle. So our chart, with the new parts in yellow, now looks like this. In North Korea, there exists a method called striking art or kyoksul, which is said to originate in Subak, but that during the 1980s it was reshaped to include free fighting format and ideas from Yoon Byung-in. Yoon Byung-in, whose life has been researched by Taekwondo historian and noted instructor Kim Soo, is one of the forerunners of modern Korean martial arts. He was born from a Korean family living in Manchuria during the Japanese occupation. There, he became very proficient in Kung Fu, and then he moved to Japan to study at the Nihon University, where he met and trained with Toyama Kanken sensei. By the end of World War II, he went to Seoul, where he taught Kung Fu at the local YMCA, becoming one of the original masters of the so-called Korean Karate, and after the Korean War, he ended living in North Korea until he died in 1983. This brings us back to the original Korean Karate pioneers where we started. Southern Chinese Kung Fu began to arrive to Okinawa with the settlement of 36 families in the 1390s, and that flow of knowledge kept pouring for centuries. It is thought that the most influential method of Kung Fu, which was called Toiti, was Yongchun Pai He Chuan, White Crane Fist, and Luohan or Monk Fist. Those, as well as other styles, were combined with the local Okinawan methods, which have been retrospectively called Tigwa, into what later became Okinawan Karate or Uchinadi, which means Okinawan hand. The Kung Fu that arrived to the Ryukyu archipelago mixed and matured for almost 400 years into a unique martial art today known as Okinawan Karate. First, it was used to train its military force, then to secure royal court protection, and finally it was used as a civilian combat method. As we know, Okinawans Funakoshi, Motobu, Mabuni, and Toyama took karate to Japan in the 1920s, where it was deeply transformed. By 1945, it passed to Korea, where karate became known as Tang-Soo-Do and Kong-Soo-Do, initially taught by 5 instructors in 5 schools, which later multiplied to the famous 9 Kwan. So this is how our updated chart looks. This last episode has the purpose to explain the greater context of 20th century Korean martial arts. It may help to assess the effect that the different sources had in the diverse combative areas and particularly on kicking technique. We must note that after World War II, Korea needed to be entirely reconstructed after the brutal abuse suffered under the Japanese domination. Just a few years later, it was hit by the Korean War. Not only the lives lost, the families destroyed, the sovereignty violated, national institutions abolished, and culture torn, but the sense of dignity and self-esteem were decimated. So, for 20 million people, the Republic of Korea was more than a country where they lived. Being an independent country, not subject to war, was something that they had longed for more than 50 years, and this was their opportunity to stand up strong and proud. The Korean martial arts boom was fueled by nationalism and the sense that no one will ever have again a chance to bully us. The fighting spirit of Koreans was summoned, and martial art leaders put all their dedication, intelligence, and creativity to design the best fighting methods they could, representing their nationality. Some went to the mountains and temples, others to the libraries, others just experimented. All of them passionately looking to build and restore. It is true that some leaders may have embellished their sources, but in Asian society, prestige comes from pedigree and lineage. Many of those narratives were essentially true, although they must be taken with a pinch of salt, considering the rebuilding spirit of the era. If we miss that point, we cannot understand those martial arts. In episode 2, I mentioned that there are 3 elements that have determined modern Korean kicking style as it was developed during the 20th century. The first was the implementation of a training method for the Korean army that was pushed by General Choi and implemented by many instructors, most from Jongdogan background. South Korea was in an unstable truce with North Korea since 1953, and some years later it became the strongest ally of the United States in Vietnam, dispatching thousands of troops and hundreds of taekwondo instructors. The military training and kicking were for real. The second element was the development of a fighting competition format for taekwondo. In particular, that is the adoption of chest guards for sparring, which were metaphorically brought without use from Japan. Koreans had a rural tradition of settling things among themselves by kick fighting, and the new format should fit that tradition. Free sparring technique continued to be improved, and literally hundreds of thousands or even millions of men during military service in Korea until present day have been exposed to taekwondo sparring as a representation of their national martial art. The third element which comes into the blend for putting together the Korean style of kicking is what I call martial art interbreeding. After the Korean War, martial artists such as Ji Han-jae, So In-hyuk, and Lee Ju-bang went in lonesome itineration to the countryside and temples to be exposed to the fighting techniques of the old arts. Others, like Kim Bok-man, were fortunate to bump into them. That's how Taekyon came to be related with the modern Korean martial arts. Ji, So, and Lee became part of the HapKiDo movement with their own kicking innovations, and Kim Bok-man joined General Choi's Taekwondo group. These are 4 leading martial artists, among others, who linked the 19th century Korean folk martial arts into modern systems. So this is the 6th and final addition to complete the Korean martial arts history chart. Why do most, if not all, Korean martial arts except Taekyon share the same kicking style, save for a few technical details? I will answer that with a phrase in Korean which captures the spirit. Kisuri choumyeon boksa hashipsio, which means if you like the technique, copy it. Since during the last 70 years, all males in Korea have undergone 18 months of military training where they are exposed to Taekwondo. This means that martial artists coming from other disciplines have also seen and absorbed much of what is practiced in Taekwondo. This means the army has become a melting pot where black belts from all styles compete and absorb, and that has provided a common base to all martial artists in Korea. In the last decades outside Korea, there has been a strong trend insisting on the origin of Taekwondo and Tang Soo Do as exclusively karate derivatives, with a negative implication that them being conceptually far from their pretended source, they have become diluted. This is an understandable reaction to counter the Korean government's attempt to hide the very significant Japanese part of Taekwondo's origin. The problem is that this fails to see the vibrant power and unique contribution of classical Taekwondo technique. There can be no doubt that Taekwondo's forms and the so-called basic technique come straight from Japanese karate, and personally I am very grateful for that. However, if we are talking about classical Taekwondo, let's make a quick check so that we see the 6 items that will show how much of karate transpired into Taekwondo. We will see that formal stances come from Japanese karate. Also, that formal blocks and strikes are mainly from Japanese karate. When it comes to kicks, we will see that they are entirely Korean, developed in the 20th century with an input of older Korean martial arts. As regards to the way of moving in consensual fighting, it is Korean, quite different from karate. The techniques that are used when fighting are completely different from the ones normally chosen in karate. And finally, the training method and the preferred physical focus come from the Korea body culture, and they are also different from karate. So when we look at the list, we see that 2 out of 6 come from Japanese karate and that the other 4 are Korean. Martial arts historian Hee-Young Kim, who put together a comprehensive Korean martial arts system called Hanmudo, has expressed his view that through the development of kicking and sine wave bouncing, Taekwondo was successfully converted into a genuinely Korean martial art. The abrupt, straight, and rather upward Shotokan karate blended with the rhythmic, curved, and downward of Korea. The fist found the foot, and Taekwondo became itself by having both. The twisting of the hips met the bending of the knees in Korea. The bouncing nature of Korean martial arts emerged both in its sparring and in general choice sine wave, and its playful yet stunning physicality is expressed as the contemporary paradox of 20th century Taekwondo being both a game and a military tool.
In WT Taekwondo sparring, both practitioners are in continuous bouncing motion. They propel themselves naturally, inserting their technique to fill the voids created by the opponent. The ability to take or provoke a void instantly while in motion is essential. If they remain still, immediate response would require extra milliseconds that cannot be spared. Continuous bouncing provides a platform for motion that is both elastic and live.
In the sine wave motion, which is characteristic of ITF Taekwondo, a continuous rhythmic bending of knees facilitates a bouncing sensation. It helps to achieve a special non-rigid power. The relaxed breathing pattern matches audible exhalation with the release of power. Body parts take their time. The power is channeled outside the body. The joints don't sustain any shock, working in a healthy and natural way. Taekwondo is neither karate nor taekyon. It has traces of both, but it is indeed completely Korean in its conception. Taekwondo is an innovative 20th century blend of Korean and Japanese tools with a Chinese touch all re-engineered by Koreans. So, what is the essence of traditional Korean martial arts? My answer is made up of 8 points. First, the versatility, agility, and use of the surprise factor. Second, its focus on attack rather than defense. Third, the emphasis on big motion and acrobatics in training and kicks in particular. There's a special body conditioning for jumping, for balancing, to attain speed and power. Number 4 comes with bouncing, elastic rhythmic bending of knees while shifting body weight during steps. 5 is eclecticism, mixing from different sources, unorthodox and creative. 6 is combining the circular with the linear. 7 is being fond to rather drastic overkill type kind of solutions for fast results. And 8 are the preferred weapons, which are the bow and arrow, the staff, the sword, short double weapons. Anything that can be used effectively will be adopted by Koreans. By the early 1970s, a generation of extraordinary kickers was well developed in Korea. The athletic, technical, and combative levels of those martial artists as regards to their kicks had never been achieved before in any other country in such a large scale. Each age has its peaks and achievements. I understand this was the high point of the Korean art of kicking. We are talking about a few thousand martial artists whose kicks were particularly fast, precise, and powerful. People who could truly fight using those skills. People who had been molded under the severity of military training, armed with a willingness to prove themselves either in battle or under the existing Korean format of full contact fighting. Many Korean martial art leaders have done their best to instill a Korean flavor into the arts that they teach in their curriculum, image and conception, and to take some relative distance to something they felt too close to the Japanese for them to feel a tradition of their own. Calling our uniforms dobok, or the place where we practice dojang, instead of calling it gi or dojo, is an external expression of something that runs deeper than just clothing or language. It shows our willingness to participate in a culture that we pass to our students. I sincerely hope that this series on the Korean art of kicking has helped you to add new routines and methods to your practice, to understand techniques at a deeper level, and to appreciate the cultural complexity of Korean martial arts. At this point of the series, you may have taken note of the framed piece of calligraphy I have here at home. It has a history of its own, and it makes a good way to close this series. In 2013, I was visiting Seoul and wanted to bring back to Buenos Aires some pieces of Korean calligraphy, so I was looking for an artist. A friend told me that I might find what I wanted at certain subway station. First I got there, I saw all the calligraphy hanging, but I couldn't find the artist. So I had to be patient, come another time, and finally I found what I wanted. It was an elderly man whose pen name is Unsan. First I asked him a couple of calligraphies about Taekwondo motifs for my dojang and my friends, and he produced them immediately. But I wanted something special for everyone at home, not limited to the martial arts. I wanted something that my wife would consider beautiful. And I said beauty, and for some unplanned reason I remembered that in classical Greco-Roman philosophy, starting with Plato and Aristotle, the qualities that were intrinsic to being were discussed. In the Middle Ages, they were further studied by Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas under the name of the Transcendentals, which in their latest version were formulated as truth, goodness, and beauty. The Catholic Church, under the influence of those theologists, concluded that in humanity all individuals at all cultures and times have an inner desire for perfection, which is manifested in the appreciation of those qualities. According to that doctrine, God Himself is truth, goodness, and beauty. When we marvel at them, we are admiring those divine qualities that are found in all creation and resonate in us. So the point is that I was here in the subway struggling to have a dialogue in half English with a few phrases I can say in Korean with the artist and a helpful lady, and I mentioned to him beauty and then the three transcendentals. I said truth, goodness, and beauty, and Un-san looked at me, nodded with a big smile, and something magic happened. He started celebrating, saying Jin Son Mi. He understood something in a way I didn't. I didn't know it then. But since ancient times, the Chinese classics identified exactly the same three principles of truth, goodness, and beauty, and had built much of their aesthetics and philosophy on them. I was incredibly lucky to find a cultivated artist who knew the classics, as did Un-san from Seoul. This is how I got a piece written in Korean and Chinese characters hanging here at home that reminds me every morning that we humans in all parts of the world have the same inner needs and that we are all the same, and that God loves us, sharing His infinite truth, compassion, and beauty. If you have liked this, if it resonates with your view of the martial arts, it would be great that we have the chance to meet personally and train together. Until then, let's keep with our training for a strong body, a wise mind, and a caring heart. Have a great life.